So, very welcome to another episode of Carpe. We have a very special guest today with us, Seana Davis. Seana is a correspondent at The Cube, which is a program on the Euronews. And she is, so to say, an expert on fake media and fake news, in my eyes at least. I'm sure many other people's as well.
Thank you.
So, Seana, just kind of before we kind of kick off, would you be able to kind of introduce yourself to people who would not really know what Euronews is, or what The Cube is, or like what is entailed in your job, so to say?
So Euronews is a pan-European news channel. We've got 12 different languages. So I work on the rolling news side, so Euronews World, the English edition. We have programs, Good Morning Europe, Euronews Now, and Euronews Tonight. So there's 3 different kind of programs, along with kind of our other additional programs, but those are the main 3. And The Cube is a segment in that. So it's where we debunk, verify, and talk about social media. We try to do like lots of different things, try not to keep it too narrow. But if we see conversations that happen online, we try to take in those conversations. If we see something that needs to be debunked, we debunk it. And we also want to talk about kind of the social media angle of what's happening. You know, we're all on our phones right now. So the latest social media news, the latest laws that are going to come in about social media. So hate speech, how to tackle hate speech, and how different countries are trying to deal with that, and how to regulate social media. Because at the minute, social media is broadly very much unregulated, which means that platforms can essentially do what they like unchecked, or as a lot of them will say, they want more regulations to help them try to tackle all of this. It's certainly not easy to tackle kind of online hate speech and all those kind of areas. So we try to take in those conversations and make it more kind of normalized aspect of news. Right now, it's not really common in many news organizations to have a dedicated desk for misinformation, debunking, trying to build up media literacy and trust. So our main focus in The Cube is in our segments, and we also have run numerous half-hour shows now, but in our segments, we try to show people where they can get every single piece that we get. So like, you can go back and get this statement, you can find this online, and try to show people how we got from A to B, so that when they look at it, it builds up media trust, which is pretty eroded right now, which is...
like I feel like nowadays,
counter.
I feel like nowadays there's such a mistrust in media in general, because people just see the mainstream media as the kind of a machine for propaganda, even though it's not, generally speaking.
Yeah.
But like, how do you find you are able to stand out as a Cube and as a correspondent yourself in kind of in a sea of information and misinformation? How do you keep that beacon of like correct information shining to the masses?
Yeah, I think the main thing is so The Cube doesn't just do all of this. So we also do, whenever there's breaking news, we go straight to The Cube. So The Cube is one of the main things is actually breaking news. So as soon as you're going to see something, we go to The Cube. And the main reason for that, there's like numerous different reasons, but one of them is the kind of technology we have means that we can just take a tweet and put it straight onto the screen, or we get UGC, so user generated content, and put that into our system and get out straight away. So we can cut all the corners of what traditional media would do. We can literally go on air like that. Recently, during the Vienna attacks, it took us 2 minutes to get on air. Means we don't exactly get to like read through it all, which is slightly chaotic, but we can have it straight like that. But what I think is because we have that technology to go straight on air, it means that we have no excuses to get things wrong. So my rule of thumb, I will never say reportedly. I'll never say according to local media it is. Unless you can say it, unless you know it to be true and you have your source and you can point to the source there, I'm not going to say it.
Very fair.
And that's, you know, especially in breaking news, things are moving so fast. It's easy to get things wrong, or it's easy to kind of just say, oh, it's this, but actually, you know, we now think it's this. And I get it, because you're trying to figure it out and trying to get the information out as quick as possible, especially, you know, and one thing I think people should be mindful of, especially media, is that in times of breaking news, if it's a terrorist attack, you're doing this out of giving the public information when they need it most. Do you know that kind of way? Right. That's the way you should think about it, not the way you should think about it as kind of like, oh, I'm trying to get the information out there. It's if you are in that city and if you need information, you should have a place that you can go to get it. And local media is always a great place. And I want to kind of cement that local media is really, really important right now. And has always been important, but it is important. But what we try to do is, unless we have it verified, unless we have gotten statements from the police, from, you know, people on the ground, it won't be run. But we have the technology to be able to cut the other corners, which means that we can still get out there straight away. So I think that's a really big thing that we need to think about when we're doing something like breaking news. It builds up that trust. And, you know, it's something that, like, no matter how many breaking news now, we haven't got something wrong by sticking to that mantra. So I think it's the right way to be. It's something that I learned very early on by, you know, my first boss. It's just like, we cannot make mistakes now. So
and would you say that this kind of way of reporting media, this kind of on the go live stream straight away, 2 minutes prep time, and using the UGC is the new way forward? Is that kind of the way the media is going to go forward now, or is there still a place for the traditional time to prepare, edit, and then report?
I think everybody does everything fast. So everybody does things fast. They'll get the camera onto the scene, you know, and even if you don't have the pictures, you can still go straight to it. Most people do it like that. But I would hope that, you know, the Cube, in terms of how we try to show people exactly where we have everything. It's not just about saying X has happened. It's X has happened, and here's how we know X has happened. And here's what you shouldn't do. For example, the attack in Nice a couple of weeks ago, or I think it was last week actually, what I kept on seeing online was tweets from unverified accounts saying this was happening in this city, this city, this city, this city, this city. It was also exacerbated by the fact that people were thinking that the whole of France was under attack. And social media was key in moving that kind of false information forward. Social media always, especially breaking news, you have people's biases, you have, you know, just tension. People are going to just spur that on. For example, I think it's Toulon was the city. The local train station put out a tweet, and the tweet said that they'd left a bag somebody left a bag at the train station, and they were going to evacuate the train station to see what the bag was. That's a normal procedure. It happens, you know. That should not be making the news. Yet there was tweets going around, you know, with thousands of likes, you know, 20, 30,000 shares saying incident in Lyon, incident in Toulon, incident in Nice, incident. There was like 7 different cities. And then what we did in the Cube was like, even if, you know, traditional media weren't going to do this, we saw so much of this in social media. So we did, here's what we know about every single thing that people are talking about online. Toulon, it was evacuated because of a bag. The bag has since been found to be nothing. Yeah. Everything is operating as normal. Despite all of this stuff online, this is not true. Next one, there was an incident in Lyon, somebody was arrested, etc. And it's trying to just take the tension away. And something that we do, which is kind of different, I think, from a lot of traditional media, is that I think we've gotten past the time now where we can't just ignore what happens in social media and all the misinformation that happens in social media. If we're seeing stuff circulating and breaking news, we will address it. For example, all of these different cities, whereas perhaps in traditional media, they'll just say, we know this in Nice, and they won't address all the misinformation on all the other side. Whereas we think it's important now because that ship is gone. Yeah. In terms of ignoring what happens on social media. It's just like, we're seeing this. This is what we know about this. So you can just calm it. You know, I guess not a lot of people, maybe people wouldn't agree with it. All kind of media would agree with it. I think it's really important to make those kind of, and treat them as public service announcements. Do you have kind of way of just
clearing the misinformation way,
we think anyway, it's important to not ignore what happens on social media anymore, not just giving the top line to a news story, but just say, we've seen these viral tweets, this is not true, and here is why. And I think, you know, some of my kind of even proudest moments have been where I see kind of people online that might be susceptible to falling for misinformation, you know, like just somebody with like a couple of tweets, and I see like some things are wrong on their Twitter account. But they watched Cube and they would comment underneath saying, I watched Euronews and this isn't true and here's why. And I'm just like, that's exactly what we should be aiming for. The fact that we can build trust with people to understand here's why, not just this isn't true because they said it's not true. That's in breaking news. I think we need to bring that in now more than ever. And I think in terms of if you're going to address misinformation, you have to show people why it's not true as well. That can be difficult with baseless claims. But if there's something online and we can say, this isn't true, X, Y, Z, 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 you can check it out, then I think that's important.
It definitely makes it much easier for people to understand what's actually happening.
Yes.
Then you did mention that there's a kind of a lot of misinformation online, and there's kind of a lot of similar patterns happening. Would you be able to kind of advise people what to watch out for when this, for example, an incident happens, or there's like a Sharpie gate that was happening during the election? Like, what should they watch out for? What are the usual suspects for fake news? Like the sources or like the claims?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is there's a couple of things to watch out for, and a lot of them we can blame algorithms, and I think there is definitely blame there. But looking internally about kind of what we can do and what we should be careful of, our own internal biases are massive problem. And just taking the US election as an example, I think there was a huge amount of videos online, and no matter how hard the tech companies tried to tackle misinformation, and they did put a lot of defenses up, but those defenses were kind of smashed down by viral short clips of videos taken out of context. But that was something that we saw kind of months before that. And just taking two separate examples, the Lincoln Project, anti-Trump project, they would have shared a video that would just take Laura Ingraham, the Fox News commentator, out of context, making it seem like she was saying something disparaging about Trump, but she wasn't. They would put that clip up, Twitter would label it, it would still get views. On the flip side, Donald Trump's campaign would put up a clip about Joe Biden, for example, saying that he was going to set up the biggest voter fraud organization in history. What he was trying to say in the interview was that he was setting up an organization to counter voter fraud. However, the 15-second clip didn't say that. That went viral days before the election, during the election, after the election, as proof that Biden had started this voter fraud organization. The main thing to think about there is, number one, what's your bias? If you have a bias, no matter what side of the political aisle, if you see like a 10-second clip, just, I probably don't have all of the context to this 10-second clip. So have that in the mind. Have it in the mind that I'm going to share if my emotions are involved. People's emotions is what drives on misinformation a lot of the time. If you're angry, if you're upset, if you're scared, breaking news, if you're scared, you share something. In an election, if you're angry, you'll share something, and you won't share it without checking, or you won't even think about the context that's needed. And then you have the people who are taking these clips out of context and putting them on social media. So much of the voter fraud evidence, I'll say, in inverted commas, what laid the ground for that was short clips on social media, shared online, amplified then by massive accounts, and that sowed the seed for what came afterwards. So it was these videos. And by the time that news organizations had debunked one video, so many more would come up. It was a real, in terms of the US elections, a wave of misinformation. It was so difficult to even keep up with all of it. Sometimes it can be like, where am I going to find this misinformation? Didn't have that problem during the US elections. Just taking one recent example, the US president, Trump, tweeted a video on his own feed a few days ago, or one video that Donald Trump uploaded. All it showed was people collecting ballots, putting them in their car. That was first uploaded by an account that was sharing QAnon conspiracy theories. It was uploaded on the 4th of November. So this account, for example, is encouraging people to share #Pizzagate, which is like a well-debunked conspiracy theory about Hillary Clinton dating back to 2016 and 17, that she was running a deep state pedophile ring outside of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. Well debunked, but that account was still sharing that kind of misinformation. It then went from that Twitter account to QAnon websites. So if anybody doesn't know what QAnon is this deep state kind of conspiracy theory that suggests that there's this cabal and Donald Trump is trying to save the world from this pedophile ring of the world elites and particularly Democrats. It's completely baseless, but it's still managed to gain ground. And it went from that Twitter account to these websites, and it went from that website to 8con, which is kind of known for very extremist views. So it was then logged on 8con. You can still find it on there. And then it went from there kind of through the internet to Donald Trump's Twitter account. Although it was debunked on November 5th. So the next day by the people like Reuters had debunked it, PolitiFact had debunked it later on, still managed to make it, despite all that, to the president's Twitter feed. and became this basis on social media of yet another video showing voter fraud. What it was people picking up ballots legally to then be collected. The Californian election, kind of the people who run the election, issued a statement at the time to say this is, people do have to collect ballots. So they were collecting the ballots kind of day before the election, or it was within the line of the election rules. You wouldn't have seen that in the video, but if you have in your mind, and it's in your bias, that people are going around collecting ballots and dumping them in a river, and if you see a short video clip, 10 seconds of people at a kind of place where you mail in your ballots and putting them in these boxes, and then somebody's telling you that this was days after the election, oh, they're still counting votes for Biden, then in your mind you're going to say, okay, that's another one.
Play on your fears.
Without having the context. Exactly. Where was it? What time is it? Who are these people? Are these people election officials? The answer was yes, they were election officials. Yes, it was within the time. Yes, these ballots. And even, people wouldn't have known on looking at that video who these ballots were for. Do you know that kind of way?
Yeah.
So it's just keeping in mind, you do not know the context when you're on social media, and particularly these 10-second clips often do not have that. Being able to step back from that is a really, really important kind of lesson.
So essentially speaking, just bear in mind that everything can be taken out of context, and all the small clips that you see could be potentially misinformation, not because of what it says, but because of the context in which it is.
Yeah, and like the little blurb on top, just one more example. There was a viral video that went around about Donald Trump before the election, and basically what it showed was a 5-second clip of what appeared to be Donald Trump kind of just going for a wander outside the White House, so going for a wander on the White House lawn. And what the blurb at the top said was, oh, look, this is proof that Donald Trump doesn't have kind of, maybe his mental fitness isn't enough for office. People are trying to use this as evidence that he wasn't mentally fit enough for office. If you're looking at the whole clip, you would have seen that actually he was walking over to Melania Trump before getting on Air Force One. It was a completely normal thing to do. But if you'd seen the 5-second clip, maybe you would have thought he was just like looking at a particular puddle on the ground. It might have looked a bit bizarre. And the blurb, and if you were somebody that might have been not a Donald Trump supporter and you would have seen that, you're like, yep, another evidence he's not mentally fit for office. You don't need your kind of AI. A lot of people last year were worried about AI coming into it. There was a video about Nancy Pelosi that made it look like she was slurring. That was shared in 2019. She actually wasn't slurring. That used AI. You might actually need kind of a computer to do that, but most of the stuff we see now, you could do it on your phone. You can, you need nothing. You just kind of clip something, pop it out, put something on it that'll be some bias, whatever it is, some political bias, and it will catch on, and it will take time to get that kind of the facts to catch up. That's the difficulty.
And with the fake news being so easy to make nowadays, as you said, just put it on your phone and you're ready to go. Should there be an AI introduced to look for those fake news, or should there be a system in place on social media to filter? Is that something that could be a future of the news online?
Companies now use AI. AI is like a massive part of their internal infrastructure, particularly when trying to combat hate speech, terrorism content, etc. The issue with AI is that it's going to be difficult for AI to detect a video showing poll workers as misinformation. That's the problem. So AI works for memes, for example. They're actually trying to make it kind of better for memes. But memes is one place where they're trying to ratchet up AI technology. Pictures, it works on picture as well, because you put in the picture, et cetera, et cetera. It's the context that you need the human eyes for that's integral. Now, Twitter, Facebook, they all hire moderators. So the way that they're trying to combat, particularly kind of put it on the hate speech line, the way that they try to combat hate speech or content that violates their policies is a mixture of both moderators and AI. Facebook said in their last report that, in the report before the pandemic, that they were taking down by far more content than ever before it was flagged. So I think this could be wrong. I think it was among 90% of the content was taken down before somebody had flagged content as being violating their guidelines, and they attributed that to AI. So their AI, they say, is working on that front, but you do need human moderators along with that. That's where the pandemic came. Facebook have admitted that the pandemic has hampered their ability to take down content that violates their guidelines. And that's because moderators had to go home. It's also kind of important to note that from kind of NGOs that I've talked to, politicians that I've spoken to French politicians, Laetitia Avia, who's the French politician that has been trying to spur on the new digital law here in France. I've spoken to her, and what she's told me is that she's been working on trying to get a digital law here in France for the past 3 years, but she still doesn't know how many moderators Twitter has. There's kind of one of the criticisms is that there's a lack of transparency, particularly about the moderating content, how many moderators there are, how they are trained. One of the NGOs that I spoke to has said that what they think is going to work is if the role of a moderator is put on the same pedestal as the role of a data protection officer. So you train them, there's kind of EU laws to come into effect with that. December 3rd, just talking about the EU is going to release their new Digital Services Act, or a draft for it. So the EU's laws haven't actually changed since the year 2000 when it comes to technology, social media, which means that it's completely outdated. You know, we didn't even have Facebook. So they're trying to fix that now. That'll probably focus on terrorism content, hate speech content. Misinformation is far more kind of complex, you know, but also, you know, terrorism content is too. France tried to put in a law that said that terrorism content had to be taken down within 1 hour. Or else of being flagged, or else platforms would have to face fines, and some of them significant fines, and also like very bad PR, you know, which is one of the biggest things that they'd be concerned about. The problem with that, though, is what do you define as terrorism content? Going back to your question about AI, the solution to that is you ratchet up the AI, which means that you're probably going to get stuff taken down that is not terrorism content, because they're trying to overcompensate and make sure they're not going to take down those rules. If it's that difficult for terrorism content, it's going to be more difficult for misinformation. So at least according to the NGOs that I've spoken to and the politicians that I've spoken to, because this is like a three-pronged thing. It's going to be NGOs and kind of these misinformation experts and anti-extremism experts. Then you have the government level, and then you have the tech level. There's the three major players here in trying to figure out how to fix this. So the role of the moderator and being more and more transparent about the role of these people as well as the AI, I think that's going to be something you're going to hear about a lot more, particularly at the end of the year, moving into next year, when the EU is going to try and add regulation to big tech.
It actually will be interesting to see how this entire situation unfolds as we move more and more online and away from the traditional media of like newspapers and TV. Actually, I say this year, as we have, as you know, well aware, with the coronavirus and many other stories, we have been a lot on social media, and because we're consuming more social media, there's much more misinformation. How did you find yourself as a correspondent working for the past year, as the social media just pretty much just exploded, and there was kind of an influx of information and misinformation about a lot of topics, coronavirus included?
So I've learned an awful lot. You know, I started working in Euronews in August 2018. And then in 2019, I was just trying to get my feet on the ground, you know, and kind of learning everything. 2020 was a whole new ball game when it comes to kind of trying to learn everything. I think in 2019, what I would say is, I mean, there's always been misinformation out there, but I was trying to figure out, you know, how do I kind of try bring this into, you know, our reporting, you know, what kind of, do you just take a topic out? Because something that kind of, in terms of trying to actually report on this is, you know, when you're building a program, our program of news, you have to think about the top lines. What's the news? You know, everything is kind of in blocks. So your top block is going to be your top news, and you have similar stories in top block. Maybe top block 3 is going to be your featurey stories, a light story at the end. But where does kind of misinformation fit in your traditional news hour bulletin of programming? I find that kind of difficult in 2019. In 2020, your top story is going to be coronavirus and all this stuff in the background. So it was the problem of kind of bringing it into the mainstream of news would no longer really existed. Pretty easy to talk about the misinformation related to your top stories, be that COVID, be that elections, and not just the US elections. We've had like numerous different elections, but finding the misinformation certainly wasn't the problem anymore. I think one of the big problems, though, is trying to do this, during the pandemic, even as a small team. We're a very small team. So when COVID started to kind of get big over here in France in March, myself and my colleague Matt went to work from home, and trying to deal with the misinformation when you're trying to have a stack of books and you're trying to put your iPhone in your stack of books and you're being like, how can I show my tweet in here when I'm trying to film this on an iPhone 5? And is this going to be on a bulletin if it's an iPhone 5? So it was learning all of that as well while trying to do the misinformation. That was tricky, but we got over there in the end. But I think that this, in terms of going back to your question about kind of the wave of information and misinformation, and I think the biggest thing from this year is I hope that it won't be as difficult anymore to bring these misinformation stories to traditional media, even though a lot of people would still be of the frame of mind of, oh, why should we do a story if it's misinformation, if we're just going to air the misinformation on air, even when you're debunking it? That was like something that a lot of people would say. And for me now, it's just, the ship is gone again. That ship is over. We have to address this and have to bring it into our news media more and more and more, and build up that trust and show why something is wrong. So that's
would you say that
one of the big,
going forward, debunking of misinformation will be almost a replacement for news? Since a lot of the information will be coming from, like a lot of information people get from just like tweets and other social platforms. And right now it's almost more important just to debunk the misinformation that's out there already, as well as actually to report.
I think that it's going to be a mixture of both. The Cube isn't alone anymore. I think when the Cube started, it was definitely this kind of revolutionary thing of bringing in misinformation into the traditional news media. I don't think we're alone in that anymore. But I think the way it's coming across now is that different kind of big brands have their own specialist reporters. The reason why I say that the Cube was kind of revolutionary in 2018 was because it was a built-in desk into the programs. There were still people, for a long time who were working on misinformation and debunking, and they're some of the best people in the world at it. BuzzFeed have incredible people. Craig Silverman, he's been working on this for years and years and years. What the Cube tried to do was to bring in this desk that was going to show you how to do something, and also going to bring in kind of UGC into kind of programming and be this breaking news desk. Now we have specialist disinformation reporters in different news organizations that are kind of regularly coming on to programming. Mariana Spring in the BBC be like one of those who is kind of their specialist disinformation reporter who would be on their radio, on their television, talking about disinformation. I think it's becoming more and more kind of a segment in the news, and people are understanding that, okay, this is like a topic that people are talking about now. But I think it's not going to eclipse traditional media. I think people want to just know what's going on in different places. And I think people still want context, people still want to know, kind of have people to come on to give the context to certain stories. I think it's really important to have really good guests on different shows who know their stuff to talk about the geopolitical context, for example, of something that's never going to go away. And what I would hope from this year is, I think a lot of people are on our phones, especially you and I, our age group, but I think that we were worried about traditional media losing its ground in the years previously, but I think this year has shown that when something is so big as coronavirus or the US elections, people still were heading onto their TV screens and still kind of reading the New York Times, which has its record-breaking subscriptions, still massive subscriptions for the New York Times. I think there's still a place for traditional media, and I hope that people will build up trust with that. So yeah.
And just going back to those two topics that you mentioned, coronavirus and the elections, what was the atmosphere like in the newsroom? Because like For people outside, it was mad enough. But for people who are in the newsrooms themselves, I can only imagine, like, with the information just constantly flowing in, it must have been like a nightmare, maybe slash a dream, because you have so much information to work with. How was it?
COVID was kind of its own thing. COVID was kind of a, how do we deal with all of this stuff that's coming in that's just wrong? And I think the difficulty for me when COVID first came, this is kind of one of the first times that I kind of had this, because I've been learning on the job too, but it is what do you do when baseless claims come out? How can I prove that this wasn't made in a lab? And, but what I'm trying to say is, in terms of when the science is only evolving, one of the biggest kind of things that I think all of us in media should think about now is how to deal with an evolving scientific story like COVID. We knew nothing in February. Nobody knew anything in February. How are you supposed to prove all of this is wrong when we just don't know? And I think we need to normalize when we don't know something. That's the big thing for me. And we need to amplify the right voices. We need to kind of build trust with the scientific community and vice versa. There was people that I went to constantly on a message to be like, hey, and like try to build up a good relationship, being like, I think this is wrong. What do you think? I mean, you're the virologist. And to have somebody to come on, for example, one kind of debunk that I did was about lemon can't cure COVID. And it might sound like ridiculous now, but when we knew nothing, people were sharing this like wildfire. Put lemon in your tea and kind of fix it. For example, I saw one post and it was like instruction 1, 2, 3, 4, and people were saying nobody in Israel has coronavirus and this is why. Now, if you went online, it was like, nope, sorry, coronavirus does exist in Israel as well. But it was going like wildfire. I found it in 6 different languages, copied and pasted. And what I wanted to do with a story like that was not just to say, this is ridiculous. Like, if you're going to take a lemon, you're not going to like be cured of COVID. It's more to explain, here's the science behind why this isn't true. So I spoke to like chemists, virologists, to be like, some of them were really kind of into it. Others were like, it's just not going to cure it. Don't know why you're asking me. Like,
it's a waste of time.
It's a waste of time. But for me, it's not a waste of time,
course.
because what we were able to do is to say, your stomach has this pH, your mouth is this pH, the virus is unstable in this one to this one. But as soon as you put it into the lemon into your system, it's going to neutralize. It's not going to change the pH of your body, because the posts were saying that, what was the way that they were saying? It should alkalize your immune system. That's what it said. But I was just like, how do you deal with something that says alkalize your immune system? I don't really know what that means. So it was just to do the science behind it. And just like, here's the pH kind of graph. Here's 1, here's 9. It's here, it's neutral between here to here. We think, according to these studies, we're still learning about the virus. So it was trying to bring that element to it, and that element of trust. Another problem with COVID was how sophisticated misinformation had become. For example, you're seeing posts, and this was difficult, but seeing posts about attribute to a reputable organization. So according to Johns Hopkins, here's what you need to know. Now, Johns Hopkins would never have issued this statement, but unfortunately, when you're trying to tell people, look at the reputable sources, and somebody sees a Facebook post that says, oh, Johns Hopkins, great, but it's not from Johns Hopkins. Somebody just typed on their computer it was from Johns Hopkins. And one of these viral posts had, here's 10 tips, and 5 of them were right. 5 of others were completely wrong. Like, one of them was, leave your clothes out in the sun and the UV light will get rid of COVID. And like, just make sure you're out in the sun. I'm like, no, do not do that. But then, another one would be, wash your hands for XYZ seconds, and that would be correct. And it was trying to be like, get it directly from reputable sources. This is an example of what you see on your social media feed. Here's why it's wrong. Johns Hopkins says it's not true. And it's then being amplified by well-meaning people. There was one that went viral a couple of weeks ago that said, here's why face masks are working. And it'd be a meme of like, one person standing here, another person standing here, another. And it'd say, you're wearing a face mask and this other person isn't wearing a face mask, then there's only 70% risk of transmission. Then that looks, just like a public service announcement. It's telling people to wear masks. But all that was made up. It didn't come from Johns Hopkins. They never issued that. There was no research to back it up. They said, and they gave me a statement that said, no, we didn't have this, but we do advise people wearing masks. But it's just the fact that even though it's giving the advice to do something that is scientifically sound of what we know right now, which is to wear masks. It's using data that comes from nowhere, and that doesn't help anybody either. Getting people to understand that it's really important to go back to basics every single time, even if you agree with something, even if you think, no, I do want to wear a mask. Don't share the meme, share the Johns Hopkins stuff, or share. And I hope people are building up trust enough in the media to, and I think the media can't get things wrong like this anymore, but to be able to say they're getting their stuff from here, which is why I think it's so important to show where we get our stuff. Even if it's in an article, to hyperlink to your stuff, to show that this person that we're talking to knows their stuff. You can trust this guy because he is, the virologist working in the Canadian lab who's been doing this for XYZ years, and that there's a scientific consensus about X now, Y now, Z now. I think that's really important. The US elections was different. The US elections was, how do you deal with an absolute wave all at once? There was that wave of COVID, but this one was, and so politically charged. And that was kind of difficult. And with the US elections, what was difficult was, how do you deal with people coming out on social media to say that there's widespread voter fraud when there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud? And you're trying to say, how do I show that there's no, I'm so used to saying, here's the meme, here's why the meme is wrong. But how do you deal with something that is baseless and there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud? But all you have to say is there's no widespread evidence of voter fraud, and you're trying to build up that trust. So for us, it was just trying to be like, here's why this is wrong. Here's this video. This was used as evidence. Here's why this is wrong. And trying to piece it together. But when there's a wave of that, and when it's being amplified, and when there's nothing for you to latch onto, and that was similar to when people were saying COVID or the coronavirus was made in a lab, when we were only trying to understand it at the time, and you actually can't latch on to something to debunk it. That's actually very difficult. I found that difficult anyway, to just say, in the evolving scientific situation, and then in the US elections context, in the situation where, the count isn't even still in yet, and we're getting this kind of stuff. That's where the difficulty came from, I think.
Would you say that the baseless information is more difficult to debunk than any other information, especially kind of a politically charged one, as opposed to kind of scientific?
I think that when something is kind of baseless, I personally find it more difficult, because I like saying, here's step 1, 2, 3, 4, and here's how you can do it. And I think that that's a good formula to follow, and it's a formula, the kind of way. Whereas if something is baseless, then you're like, we have no evidence to suggest this is true.
It's almost opinion versus opinion to an extent.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just more the case of, what can I show that shows that something is baseless? That's more difficult than saying, here's your video, boom, 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 boom. So that's the tricky element, I think. And something that I think is important as well for fact checkers is to keep on looking at the latest research of what works and what doesn't work. For example, they're actually called truth sandwiches. It's from Poitner, the fact checking institute. And also from I think it's really important to keep talking to psychologists. I spoke to a psychologist just before the US elections about kind of what we should do to get people prepared. And she told us more about the concept of pre-bunking. So get people aware of the hot topics that are likely to become the misinformation hotspots. And they all did, actually. Voter fraud, voter intimidation, and calling the election early. Those were her 3 hot topics. And we kind of did stuff before the election to say, look, here's what we expect to be the hot topics. If you see stuff online, be careful about stuff that claims stuff about these 3 topics. And they became the big hot topics. And it was good to have spoken to numerous psychologists about this. That the truth sandwich it's not about just saying X is wrong. It's about amplifying what's correct first. So let's just say somebody said the masks don't work. What we'd say is there's a scientific consensus now, I'm just kind of throwing this out there. Probably wouldn't say exactly this, but there's a scientific consensus out there now that masks work. Despite this claim is being said, it's not true. This is the scientific consensus. Truth, misinformation, truth. So you're not just saying this is wrong, because that's the first thing that people will hear, and there are some people that'll latch on to that. If you say truth, misinformation, truth, you've sandwiched it in there, and you're doing as much as you can to wrap the misinformation in truth. And you're showing what's true, and then you're saying this is wrong. I think it's really important to keep up to date with all of that. And that's going to change, it's going to evolve with the latest information as well. So, but that's really important to keep up with the methods that work and keep up with the academic community that's working on this kind of stuff, and to amplify those kind of academic voices too. I think is really important in misinformation.
Very much. And just kind of, I want to ask you, what has been like the most bizarre debunk that you had to do?
This one is Wayfair conspiracy. I don't know if you heard about this one, but the Wayfair conspiracy it was actually the moment when I realized the QAnon community was going to get amplified, because I saw so many people on my own social media that were sharing it, and I was like, what? So the Wayfair conspiracy basically suggested that there was a human trafficking ring through the Baseless. I need to just pretext this, that there was a human trafficking ring being run through the Wayfair furniture shop, and because furniture was being named after people, so like I'm trying to think of a name, the Ben desk, then this was actually somebody called Ben that was being human trafficked when you bought this. And to try and debunk that was bizarre. But and the one thing that I think about QAnon is that I find actually quite sad is the fact that human trafficking is a problem.
Definitely, yes.
There's no doubt about it. Pedophilia is a massive problem, and I think that this completely delegitimizes it. And I think that's kind of the issue for me personally when I'm thinking about QAnon, is like, if what I always think about all the time when I'm doing any story is, if I was the parent of somebody who is in a situation, would I be okay with something being on air? Or if I was a family member of somebody, I think it's really important to keep that in your mind. If there's breaking news, if for example, in breaking news and somebody dies, always remember in your back of your mind, or in your front of your mind, if I was a family member, would I be, okay with what was on air? So with the Wayfair conspiracy, when people were sharing photos of this cabinet and a photo of a missing child that went missing 10 years ago, what I think is, imagine if I was a parent and my missing child was missing and somebody's thinking that this cabinet is where they've gone from. So that, it is ridiculous, but it's just, that's the human element I think that people need to really realize when they're sharing stuff like this, is that's actually somebody's kid, that went missing. And so the Wayfair conspiracy was something I actually felt was important to tackle, because there's people in my circle that latched onto it, and people, I would say my circle, but my social media feeds, I was seeing people everywhere sharing Wayfair Gate. And then what I find difficult with that is, we have the statement from Wayfair, we have the fact that this is baseless, but you're still going to have people who are going to send me a message on my Instagram saying, you just said it was baseless with nothing. And their proof was that this pillow was named after someone, that was their proof. Yeah. And it was like, no matter what you did, that was going to be in their minds. The big reason why QAnon, I think, has been amplified so much, and the Wayfair Gate was amplified so much, was that we are in one of the most tense times that we will ever be in. And conspiracy theories aren't new. We've always had conspiracy theories. Did we land on the moon? Yeah. They've always been around, but this time, when have people who are stuck at home, are worried, are scared, and they see QAnon, there will be people that latch onto that. There's going to be people that don't know what to believe anymore when everything is so up in the air. And I think one of the biggest things to remember is, there's somebody in Capitol Hill now who has advocated for QAnon. This is not kind of the corner of the internet anymore. You know what I mean? This has really become mainstream. And so we could have just laughed at kind of the Wayfair conspiracy and thinking that this is ridiculous. Some people did do that online, but it's important to say this is baseless, we'll move on. This is baseless, we'll move on. But there's a lot of animosity from the QAnon conspiracy theory to people who debunk, to fact checkers, to the so-called mainstream media as well. So, but that was probably, that took the biscuit, I think, from this year.
And then just in terms of 2020, it's been quite an eventful year, to say the least. A lot of it has happened, and a lot of news are kind of breaking every day. would you say people are just much more susceptible to believe into like any mad story because so much has happened this year? Like, what would your opinion be from a point of view of all the stories that you were doing this year as compared to like previous years?
I think people believe things now because of the uncertainty. There's so much uncertainty, you know. We imagine being in 2019 and saying in March you're going to be told not to leave your house. No, here in France, we had in March, I mean now as well, we're only supposed to say within 1 kilometer radius, I need 2 certificates to be able to leave my house. I have to go every single time and go on an app on the government website to say I'm going here, here, here. This is the reason why. I can go down to work because I'm a journalist, you know, and that's one of the things that you're able to leave. I never would have thought that a year ago, you know, but here we are, and it's still here. There's still uncertainty, you know, in January, February, March, April, which we were still trying to figure out, like, what is this virus, you know. That has laid the ground for people to latch on to stuff they wouldn't have latched onto before. Mix that in with deep polarization that has been there for years and years and years and has been only building up. Mixing those two together, and you have really fertile ground for people to latch onto stuff that's just not true. QAnon isn't, and I'm using that as just one example, QAnon is a spectrum now. You can't think of QAnon as just the people that believe in the Wayfair conspiracy. It's also people that think that the virus isn't true and are starting to think now, oh, you know, there's a deep state just against us. This is all just a plot against us.
Conspiracy.
And conspiracy, yes. And a lot of people believe that. And I think that's why it's more important now more than ever to be measured in your response, to show why things are not true, and to be, unfortunately, ready for vitriol that comes with that. I don't think that should be part of the course, but it is. Yeah, I think that until there's a build-up of trust, you know, we have had, and this is something that I don't believe that we should be debating things like climate change anymore. And I don't, you know, I think it's important to have open dialogue about different topics, but when there's something that is a scientific consensus, I do not believe in debates about that from perhaps a non-scientific person with a scientific person, you know. I think it's important to understand what the pillars of science are. I think the fact that there's been, you know, some people that believe that it's okay to have a politician to debate a scientist, and I've seen those roundtables, a politician to debate a scientist about climate science. I think those days, you have to be careful about that now. You know, we are here now with some people believing conspiracy theories and that the pandemic isn't true because years before we didn't have enough scientific knowledge and background. And I think that, for me, is one of the biggest things. I think if people understand the scientific method, they're not going to click share on something that they don't know the full context of. I personally think, and this is probably not this is my own personal opinion, I think that we need to amplify science and the step 1, 2, 3, the scientific method more and more and more now. And I think the fact that there was so much climate denial has led us to this. I think it should not be a surprise that the US has handled COVID the way it has handled, because years before, people didn't believe that climate change was real. You can't take 2020 in isolation. It built up through the years.
You would almost say it's a domino effect.
It's a domino effect. Things build up. Nothing is in isolation. And I think that, sure, in times of tension, we're going to have misinformation and conspiracy theories. In times of deep polarization, we're going to have that. Those are just two elements of it. But science denial, for me, is the underlying factor to all of it. And I think that scientists need to come out, and I think a lot of them have, and try and build up that trust with the community. I think science communication is huge. And I think that journalists need to build up trust and need to understand that science is full of nuances and it's okay to not know something. And I think we need to kind of get more in line with that. That's my big thing.
Thank you very much, Seana. I really enjoyed this talk. I'm pretty sure all of our listeners enjoyed it as well. And I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank the listeners for listening to this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.